Hi, everybody, and thank you once again for taking time to join us. Just want to start this with a little bit of a warning. We do have, we've been having some technical difficulties with GoToWebinar, so I'm hoping that this will, it won't crash or anything before the end of our presentation. But in the event that it does, I'll do my best to reconnect. So I just wanted to kind of let you know that. Hopefully everybody can see my screen and hear me. With that, let's just go ahead to get into it. Hopefully your week has been going well. You had a great Labor Day, and we can get into this topic. So I'm going to skip over some of this. This is our last session, so I don't think it, kind of going through all the preamble stuff. I want to spare you that. I do truly appreciate you sticking with this. And if you're just joining us and this is the first time you've heard about this session, highly suggest you go back to the very beginning and kind of go through the other series that we've covered. You can see some of them on the screen. This is our last session of the 6-part series. This session really kind of what my hope is to walk through how we can use the material we've discovered and explored in the prior sessions in this session and kind of talk about how we can use some of the things. We're not going to do everything we've talked about, but just selectively talk about things that and hopefully remind ourselves of some of the things we spoke about early on and some of the things we need to think about from a defensive position. So with that, let's kind of get into that. Again, I'm not going to go into the program thesis. I think you've heard that enough times by now, or some of the objectives, other than just to remind you that a great opportunity here is to really think about this in terms of a mini tabletop. You can certainly, especially this session, you could translate this session into a tabletop really easily. So that might be an idea or a takeaway for you from this. The big one here is to share this with colleagues and just talk about if this happened here or these types of attacks occurred, or how would we detect it, how would we respond, what do we need to put in place to to kind of help improve our defenses against something of this nature. So with that, um, I think just to set the stage a little bit on kind of what I'm hoping to do with you over the next 20, 30 minutes or so is think about what I would do if I was going to go after a target, not just from like a pen test perspective, but actually try to take out a target. I think the biggest challenge with pen testing is that there's always rules. One of the things when I talk to board of directors, and sometimes board of directors will say to me, "Well, what's one question I can ask, my IT team or my IT security or my CIO or my CISO, to figure out where we are with security," right? Which I know on one hand is very reflective of a board of directors and sometimes C-suite members in terms of they just want to get the bottom line and they want to make everything really simple. And many of you will say, well, it's really hard to kind of explain to everybody, where we are from a security perspective with just one question and one answer. And so when I did get asked that question the very first time was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I kind of gave this long-winded answer around, well, that's very hard to do. It's much more complicated. You can't just have one question. There's a lot of things that go into it, blah, blah, blah. And it really kind of gnawed at me for a while. And I eventually came up with one question that you can ask yourselves, your board can ask you, you can ask others. And it really is a very clear reflection on where you are from a security perspective. In fact, to be honest with you, even though we do HIPAA assessments and maturity modeling and 853, whether you do high trust or whatever you're doing, I think this one question is more telling and more valuable than any risk assessment you can do, and happy to debate that with people. But the one question that I've taught board of directors now to ask, so if you ever hear this, you'll know where it came from, is would you agree to a no holds barred, no rules of engagement, anything goes penetration test? And if the answer to that question is no, then you know you have security issues. And it doesn't matter what your compliance testing risk assessments tell you, unless you're willing to say yes to that, you've got work to do. Now, what I do teach boards when I ask that question is you need to say, if the answer to that is no, why not? And or more simply, what are the top 3 reasons why you would not agree to a full-blown, no rules of engagement, anything goes pen test. Whatever those top 3 reasons are, those are the things you need to go fix. And typically they're going to sound something like this. Well, what if you knock over a system? Well, security should assure that systems don't get knocked down. Well, we should have resiliency in place, right? We should never have disruption of operations. So if you're worried about something being disrupted, challenges that you probably don't have the right security and recovery and continuity in place. What if they deploy malware? They deploy some kind of nefarious virus Trojan thingy? Well, you should be able to detect that, right? What if they exfiltrate all our data, right? Well, again, you're supposed to not allow that to occur. So if you ask yourself that question and you go really head on and deal with, that whole thing, your security will monumentally increase. So why am I telling you all this? Because kind of the next few slides, what I'm going to do is walk through a no holds barred, anything goes, no rules of engagement attack, right? Because that's kind of what attackers do. And this is really the fallacy, again, between pen testing and attack. It's attack, there's no rules. Pen testing, there's always a rule. So you never have a real world, reflection of what somebody can do to you unless you were really willing to do a anything goes test. I think it's really interesting, and I'll just add to this, that in the healthcare sector specifically, we see very few red team tests. One of the things we do when we're doing pen testing for clients is we ask them kind of what's the severity you want. You want a severity 1, which is a really lightweight pen test, or do you want a severity 5, which would be the anything goes, and a severity 4 is like a red team. So red team isn't even the full-blown experience, right? A red team, if you guys ever do them, you still have rules. Most people do a severity 3. Why would somebody do a severity 1? Because they're honest with themselves. I love when people say to me, let's do a severity 1. We haven't done a pen test in a few years. We're not really sure what's out on the network. Let's do a severity 1. Let's get that stuff addressed and fixed. Let's come back in 6 months, do a severity 2 or 3. Usually that's where they stop. We don't usually get people asking us for red teams or severity 5. So if you're interested in any of those, please let us know. We'd love to have somebody say, do whatever you want, and we're good to go. So in this kind of next few steps, we're going to walk through, kind of that whole process from the attacker's perspective as to what we would do. So we're going to kind of talk about our mission objective, right? Our mission objective for this case study, if you will, is to establish command and control, right? And we're going to utilize the TTP from the previous 5 sessions or the 6-part series, right? And just kind of use that. And the way we're going to walk through this is pretty similar to how I look at attack work. I don't look at it from a MITRE perspective. When I'm going to go attack something, I typically start with a mission plan. We start doing intelligence gathering. We're going to do an assessment, and then we're going to do some exploitation, and then we're going to try to cover our tracks or exfiltrate, or maybe not. Maybe exploitation is our goal, and we're going to make it very well known to everybody that we did this. So that's kind of the phases that we're going to go through. And if you're ever planning a tabletop or something of that nature, these are kind of good phases to think about. Like, okay, what's the mission plan? How can we gather intelligence in the target, and so on. So we're going to go through each one of these, and what I'm going to try to do, hopefully do a good job of, is correlate different things we learned to each one of these phases. And then you can kind of think about other things you would add in those phases if you were on the attack side of this. And obviously, most importantly, how would you defend against this? So hopefully this serves as a really good review of everything that we've covered, or many of the things we covered. So first thing is we need to, from a mission planning perspective, and I will tell you that when I've worked with other people on attack work, the best attackers, whether they're professional grade or just amateurs or somewhere in between, will do mission planning. I've always found that really interesting, that even some of the underground groups that you may hear about do mission planning, right? They really do sit down and think about, who we're going after, what we're doing. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, there was a case in Germany where a hospital was targeted and got hit with ransomware. The hospital went and diverted patients being transported to the hospital. Unfortunately, a patient that was en route to that hospital needed to be diverted. The nearest hospital was 30 miles, the next nearest hospital was 30 miles away. The patient died in transport. And so the German police opened up a homicide investigation. They considered that an act of homicide. And they figured out who the attackers were. They were in another country, but in any case, they got a hold of the attackers and they said, you know, you guys attacked us in such a hospital, and you know, we know it was you, and somebody died, right, because of that attack. What was the most interesting part of that, right? The shocking part and the sad part is that somebody died, but the most interesting part to me was what the attackers said to the police when they had this conversation, and this was done through chat windows as part of the ransomware, so it wasn't face to face or anything like that. And so what the attackers said was, "Oh, we're sorry. We didn't actually intend to target you. We were looking to go after this other hospital, and I guess your names are similar, so we mistook you for the hospital we really wanted to go after." Now, the reason I bring that up is because of this concept of mission planning, where really it kind of illustrates for you that they had an intended target. Now, there was a mistake made and they went after the wrong target, and they admitted to that, but it does illustrate that there is mission planning that happens. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because when you're thinking about who is your adversary, who are you really defending against? Now, a lot of times we get caught up in the tools that we purchase, right? Like, well, does it do this? Does it do that? Does it have this feature? Does it do that feature? And yet we're really not thinking about, well, who's coming after me? What tool do I need, right? If we're thinking about securing our homes and you live in a really bad neighborhood, you may want 4 deadbolts, right? And an alarm system and maybe a moat around your house. If you live out in the middle of nowhere and your biggest threat is a bear, you might have a different set of protection, right? And a different way of protecting that door. So understanding the adversary is critical, and understanding that they really are thinking about what they're going to do to you is key. So I thought it'd be interesting to start with how I would start an attack, which is this mission planning. And in this case, we've got really 2 kind of objectives, right? Actions on objectives, AOs. And the first one is that we want to execute an operation which causes loss of confidence in the organization's ability to protect human life, right? So that's like our big thing, right? We're not after money here. We're really after, can we shake the confidence of people in the organization to protect human life? And then the second one is impact operations, right? Create psychological impact to employees. So our whole goal here, for whatever reason, is to really shake up the organization and the people in it and get them scared. Now, who knows why we're doing this? And you know, ours is not to question why, but to kind of execute if we were part of a broader organization carrying out attacks. So that's our mission. And so once we have our mission or our marching orders, we're going to kind of move into intelligence gathering, right? And this is where a lot of time is going to be spent in assuring we don't get caught. And we've talked about this. One of the series we talked about was low and slow attacks and how to perform covert operations, and you know what we can do in those cases. And really the way that we're successful in carrying that out is through intelligence gathering, is to really figuring out what's on that network, what's the security posture, a whole host of different things that we're going to look at. And once we have that, it really helps us that once we're in the network to move around and carry out operations on the network without getting caught. So this upfront intelligence gathering, if you were going to carry out an attack, is vital to you, right? You really want to understand, like, is this organization using, you know, a SIM? Are they using IDS? What do they got for antivirus? Do they have a third-party SOC? Do they have their own SOC? Do they not have a SOC? You know, how are they dealing with things, right? So we really want to kind of meet our mission objectives of shaking the confidence of an organization. The intelligence gathering is going to be a fundamental part of that, so that we can ultimately remain undetected as long as we need to position ourselves for exploitation. So in this case, we've decided that the intelligence operations that we're going to conduct really come down to 3 things. And yes, these are pretty generic, but they'll work for our purposes. The first one is we want to figure out what network assets are out there, and then target the organization's firewalls and VPNs if possible. This is the broadest scope, right? This is the most far-reaching net that we're going to toss. What I want to point out to you on this is that often when, how do I put this? Let's just pretend I was doing a pen test, not attacking something. One of the big things that's important to do is to do full sweeps of like your /24 slash whatever network, external facing. You'll be surprised how many times we find that there are things out there assigned to your network ranges that are still active, but nobody's taking care of them. This happens a lot. We'll find URLs, domains, assets that are publicly facing. And so one of the things I would implore you is if you do pen tests, get the pen testers to do some type of address scans. I mean, if you have to pay a little more for it, don't just say, here's 20, 30, 40, 50 IPs and just go after them. You really want a broader net. In this case, if I'm going to attack someone, then I'm going to cast a pretty broad net in hopes of finding different ways in besides just the obvious, right? The firewall, the VPN, the portals, whatever is facing the external world. The second thing we're going to look at is search patterns, right? We want to see what's the organization searching on, and we talked in the session we did on I believe it was on social compromise or K2K attacks. We talked about gathering search pattern data, right? How can we monitor your organization and see what you're searching on? Now, obviously, that's important because if we see you searching on IDS, we know you may either not have an IDS or the IDS you have you're not happy with. If you're searching on patch management, probably not doing a good job on patch management, right? So having an idea of what you're searching on can help us start to understand where you may have some gaps. The second part of that is it may also give us clues as to going after employees directly if we want to phish somebody, right? If you're searching for, if we see a lot of people in your organization searching for vacation rentals, or traveling nurses, right? It is actually a really good example. If a lot of people in your organization are searching for the word traveling nurse opportunities or traveling nurse jobs or per diem, then putting together a phishing campaign that talks about traveling nurses or per diem work would be great, because you have people doing that. They're going to see something come into their inbox about travel nurses. They're going to be very interested in that. And so that's an opportunity for us to take advantage. And then, once from that, we can start evaluating, like I just mentioned, employee targets. We want to do this as covertly as possible, right? So all of our intelligence gathering is going to be based on open source intelligence. We're going to try not to, at this point, go after anything directly. And let me clarify that. If we were doing this for real, we would have a phase 1 intelligence gathering and a phase 2 intelligence gathering. Phase 1 intelligence gathering is going to be completely covert. It's going to be completely based on open source. We're not going to touch anything in your environment or external facing. Phase 2 intelligence gathering is going to be when we actually start scanning and probing and trying to figure out what's talking and not talking, what ports are open, what's responding to pings or not. We're actually going to be interacting with systems. So think about intelligence gathering in 2 phases, right? Your first phase is that foundation. That's going to identify opportunities for you to go further, gather more intelligence in phase 2. So just coming and drawing out of our bag of tricks, right, over the 6-part series has been a whole bunch of stuff we hopefully have put forward for you to kind of go, and some things you may want to go look at. One of them, first thing we're going to do before we start any intelligence gathering, so we can remain covert, is set up a proxy chain. We talked about proxy chains, I think, in the first series. When we talk about circumventing firewalls and VPNs and how do we do that and hide ourselves. So we need to set up a proxy chain so we can cover our tracks, but we're going to set up 2, if not 3 proxy chains. Now, the reason we're going to want to do 2 to 3 and not just 1 is in case you block one, right? And maybe somebody figures out, oh, this is part of an IOC, right? So we're not just going to go, whoops, they got us, and tear down our attack. Or give up on our mission. The mission's got to go on. So we might as well set up 2 or 3 proxy chains. And if we really want to kind of confuse things, we can use each of them, right? Like we may go after you with 3 different proxy chains and kind of see what happens with that. But at the very least, the most important thing is if you take one down, we already want to have another couple of proxy chain systems set up and ready to go so we can just continue forward. Second thing we're going to do in this case is showdown, right? We're trying to figure out what you got out in the world that may not be apparent to everybody. So yeah, we can do a sweep of your /24 or whatever you have. But most importantly, you know, Showdown's already probably cataloged things. So we're going to start figuring out, like, do you have CCTVs? What are your WAPs? You know, what other things do you have broadcasting to the world? And can we exploit any of that? We've talked about Showdown. We've kind of walked through some of that capability. So we're going to employ Showdown here as part of our intelligence gathering. Do we use it every time? No, but it is a good tool to use in this situation where our ultimate goal is to establish command and control. You know, the next piece of this is firewall. So we have a directive here to try and go after your firewall. So we need to kind of figure out, can we get through that firewall? So firewall, we've talked about this in the earlier sessions, you know, is a tool that lets us probe your firewall and see if your rule sets are configured correctly, or if there's an exception to the rule chains that we can compromise, right? So whether you've patched the firewall or not, this is really more about testing your skill at writing effective rules, and writing effective rules in a way that one set of rules doesn't cause an exception for another set of rules, right? So we're going to firewalk, and again, this is probably the firewalk stuff will probably be intelligence gathering phase 2, because we're going to touch your firewall. So, you know, we're going to get all our background stuff in place first. We're going to look for misconfigurations, right? That's going to be a big part of this piece of our intelligence gathering is, you know, are there misconfigurations? Are there things that are exposing private IP address spaces or private IPs or host names within your environment? You know, we talked about this early on as well, is, okay, how do we get inside your network if your firewall really is locked down and your VPN's good to go? Is there something else? And we find all the time, whether it's the exchange systems, especially database systems that are just configured incorrectly, and they expose themselves to the external world. And once we have that, we can start using that information in context with firewall to figure out how do we circumvent the firewall rules, because we now have a valid internal IP address. And the interesting part about these kind of misconfigurations, a lot of times, even if you're natted, they're giving you the IP address of the internal environment without pre-nat. So it's a pretty cool thing if you can find one when you're doing work, attack work. And then social media, right? Like, the other piece here is we want to figure out what employees we may be able to exploit, use, or pretend that we're them, right? Depending on where we go with this attack and the exploit side of this, we really want to figure out what is it, what knobs can we turn on the social side of the world, right? And so some of the scripting and some of the things that we may end up doing to people are going to come from what intelligence we can gather about your employees. So, you know, that will be part of this intelligence gathering. So as we're going forward, you know, to get ready to exploit, these are all kind of the tactics. And so based on the mission planning in our action on objectives, you know, these are the tools I would be using. My hope here, one of the things I want you to kind of see as part of intelligence gathering, is when there's a concentrated effort of an attacker coming after you, that, you know, there's a discipline you're trying to do. And one of the things about discipline does not mean pattern, right? If I went after a different objective or at a different set of objectives, I may change up my tools, right? I may not use these. What I want you to understand also is there's a variety of different tools that are being used just to gather intelligence here. And we're going to see that kind of continue as we go through this attack, that it's not just, oh, they deployed blah, blah, blah malware and that was it, right? There's a lot more effort that goes into this when somebody's really targeted your organization. Now, going back to social media, I want to highlight something here that is kind of important for you to understand. I don't think we talked a lot about this when we did the social media compromise session. This is this is a screenshot of something called Catfish or social Catfish or something like that. There's a bunch of these engines out there, and they become much more powerful and much more kind of interesting in terms of their capabilities. Used to be that they were a lot of false positives. Now they're getting much better. So I'm not endorsing social catfish or not. I'm trying to illustrate the opportunity to exploit or to gather intelligence, right? through these types of visual search engines, right? So basically, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, what happens with this is you take a photo of somebody. You can take a photo of your friends, you can take a photo of a coworker or whoever it is, and you upload it to these engines. And then they scour the internet, right? And they basically look for, using machine learning and AI and visual recognition algorithms, every photo in the world, or every photo they can crawl, that looks like the person who you uploaded the photo of. Now, what's become even more powerful with this is not only do they find every photo image that kind of looks like the person you uploaded, they also can start to correlate email accounts, home addresses, tax records, credit records, other data, right? So you can get a list of kind of everybody's social profile, their entire social profile, off of a photo. So the question is, well, how do you get the photo, right? Well, easy, right? You can get stuff off of people's website, right? Like, let's say we wanted to go after a hospital, and we go look at who's on the board of directors and who's the C-suite, who's going to be in their suit smiling, for their About Us photo and our leadership team photo. And so you just take those, right? Copy them, upload them here, and boom, you get a ton of stuff. I've used it. I can tell you it's rather interesting. Some of the photos that you find, they're not always, just being very honest. A lot of times you're going to find photos that are not G-rated, and you may find that colleagues have a variety of different interests, and they're probably thinking, who's ever going to see this? And lo and behold, you have visual search engines. There's still, this is an evolving technology, so there's still very a good amount of false positives with this, but even the false positives, like where you see a photo and you're like, is that person? And then you realize, well, no, it's not. It takes you a few minutes to figure out, like, wait a minute, that's such an extraordinary match, that you question yourself, like, are those actually, is that really that person or not? The reason this is important, obviously, is for exploitation of the employee base, and having information we can use. Now, even if there's nothing compromising, just the fact that we can get emails, we can get social media account names, we can get other things from this employee that we can use, right? And you may be wondering, well, okay, well, so I'll give you an example of one thing that's interesting. If I can find an employee that works at your hospital, and I can get their personal email account, not the hospital email account, and now I can email them on their personal email address, but they're using a hospital laptop, there's a very good chance that they're going to open that email. It's an interesting kind of psychological ploy here. Like, if I send somebody an email to their work account, and I send the exact same email to their personal account, you will find that 80% of the time, the person drops their guard with their personal account. So, if I want to compromise them, I'm better off finding out their personal email, sending that email that's infected or has a bad link in it or something, and they probably will click on it. Their work email, they're so used to you guys telling them, don't click, be careful, blah, 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 that ultimately they safeguard that, but they don't make the mental transition to the personal email. So a little free advice: when you're doing security awareness training, make sure you tell people, like, hey, any email, whether it's work or personal, you should be using the same kind of security context or security preventive measures, or whatever you want to call it. So obviously, at this point, we've invested a lot in intelligence gathering, a lot of different things we can do, and we can take things in many different directions based on what we find here, right? We're not relying on any one tactic. We're not like, well, let's just go beat up their firewall, right? We're going to kind of, at this point, step back and figure out what we want to do. And so that's kind of where the assessment stuff comes in, right? So at this point, we've got all this data, right? We've probably spent some time on this. We may have different people working on different parts. Like, one person maybe do firewalking, another person's doing social media and intelligence gathering, somebody else is managing the proxy chains, whatever it is. If somebody's analyzing Shodan. Now we're going to all sit back down and kind of figure out, what do we want to do, right? And how we want to prioritize things. So kind of based on just throwing this together, I thought, all right, well, if I was being lazy, probably the first thing I would do is go after the firewall results. Is there opportunity to get through the firewall? It's obviously the most direct. It's the easiest to hide myself in if it is able to be compromised. So, it would be like, go ahead and do that. Obviously, the Shodan results, typically Shodan gives us stuff that's not patched, older things that are not under the control of IT, that may be broadcasting information or configurable. Oxygen control systems, building management systems, facility management, CCTV, physical security, all of those things, could show up in Shodan results. So that would be my second priority. Employee remarks on Glassdoor, I'm highlighting that because, again, it's another social media outlet. If you got people that are upset about the organization and they're posting on Glassdoor, they may make interesting people to go target and talk to. We'd look for any job postings regarding older technology, right, and using Windows 2008. But you may have, we've talked about this, if you have in your job postings, we need somebody with 2 or 3 years of Windows 2008 experience, then you've kind of helped me fingerprint your organization. So you just got to be careful about that. And then ultimately, maybe we do a physical compromise. Maybe this is a big enough mission or project that we're going to go ahead and just say, the heck with it. We're just going to go right to the source. Physical compromise, especially in healthcare, is really just such an easy thing to do. If you have not done a physical pen test before, highly recommend it. You'd be surprised what you may learn. And you may be surprised to realize that you've put so much time in defending the perimeter that the interior is much more open than you think. So, just something to think about. So we've got kind of our priorities, and again, so one thing I want to point out here is a lot of times when we think about assessment, we're thinking vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scan. From the attack world, we've already done that, right? Like on the attack side of this, we've already, in phase 2 of the intelligence gathering, we've already done whatever mapping or whatever we're going to do to the external environment. What we're trying to figure out here is, how do we cross the bridge, right? How do we get over that chasm and get inside the internal network? Once we do that, we're going to be in exploitation mode. And running vulnerability scans once we're inside your network probably isn't going to happen very often from an attacker, because we don't want to make a lot of noise. That's a pretty big noisy thing to do with someone. So we've got our priorities. Assessment is about truly assessing the intelligence that we've gathered, right? So at this point, we're into exploitation, and I wanted to kind of get this down to a bite-sized, manageable example. So we're going to do a few things. We're going to rely on some of the things we talked about, and we're really going to try 3 different things on this organization. We're going to try to do some phishing. We're going to use whatever intelligence we gathered to do that. We're going to attempt to breach the firewall and go into the next phase of our firewall. And we're going to try a physical breach, right? This is going to be our backstop. This is going to be like, okay, the other stuff didn't work, and we couldn't get, these guys really did a lot of great job, educating users on not to fall for phishing. The firewall's really locked down. We can't get past that. So, okay, our backstop is, then heck with it. We'll go just breach them physically. So here's the thing. Well, let's just get into each one of these. So we're kind of going to use this whole what do you call attack that we talked about earlier on, where we're really going to use the technology as it was designed, right? We're not going to kind of introduce through our phishing attack any malware or Trojan or anything of that nature, right? We don't want to tip off anybody. We want to remain covert. We really want to just gain access to the environment as easily as we possibly can without setting off alarms. So we don't really want to give you anything in the log files or trip your SIM or whatever cool magic tricks you have. So we're just going to send an email address as if it's coming from the HR department. Now, remember that we did a lot of phishing stuff, right? We did a lot of social media stuff during intelligence gathering. We may have used something like Catfish to figure things out about people. So what we're going to try to do is find a few employees and send them a certificate of appreciation. right? That's all we're going to do. There's nothing in the certificate of appreciation. There's no like, weird, what do you call it, malware, Trojan, anything of that nature. All we really need them to do is kind of open the email and click to download their certificate of appreciation. And when they do that, there's going to be a DOT file, right? A DOT template that's stored over on this attack server. So when you open this, or when you open this certificate, this file, this PNG, or sorry, this document, we're going to send your credentials, right? Your user ID and your hashed password over to this attack server. And that's all this is, right? We're not doing anything else. Once we have that user ID and that hash on our server as the attackers, then we can sit around and try to break that hash. And it's going to come down to what are your complexity rules and what do you have in place from a password policy. But that's going to be it. Nothing fancy, right? That's all we need to do. And we don't need to go trip your Sophos antivirus or Bitdefender or whatever you have. Now, there's a risk with this. As the attacker, the risk and the conversation we would have internally if we were all doing this for real is, well, what if the person replies to the email or says, hey, HR, thank you very much. Really appreciate you recognizing me. So we may use a different kind of thing. Maybe that argument has a lot of weight and we don't want to trip ourselves up. But what I want you to take away from this is the technique of, doing something where we just need somebody to click, right? We don't need to get onto their machine. And the reason I'm telling you that is because I think a lot of times we're assuming phishing means getting on the machine, and I'll hear CISOs or security people tell me, well, we've got blah, blah, blah product, and it would just quarantine that. And it's like, all right, well, we've learned that back in 1989. So as an attacker, I don't go and put stuff on your machine now. I just try to get you to click. Which, by the way, this is a really cool thing to do if you want to go out and do a phishing attack on your employees and see if they fall for this. And there's a couple variants to this, but that's the phishing attack, right? Let's just see if we can get the user ID and the hash. Obviously, once we do that and we've hopefully worked through cracking that hash, there's a couple things that we can do at that point, right? We can try to get in through VPN. We can try to see if employee portals work, try a whole bunch of other things. We now have user ID and passwords. Depending on who fell for this, could be a pretty powerful set of user ID credentials. So, one thing that trips this up is MFA. Though recently started playing with some ways to get around MFA. So maybe in the future we'll do some kind of bonus content and show you how to get around multi-factor authentication. I'm only telling you that because I think we're putting too much faith in multi-factor. I think it's critical. You should do it. You really, really should. But we're starting to see that there's some creative ways to get around multi-factor. So that was that. The second piece, walking the firewalk stuff, I'm not going to get into much deeper. We can go back to the first session. I do want to visit the physical compromise, the actual getting on site. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations don't think about physical compromise. We're all focused on protect the perimeter. And you should be. I'm not negating that. But don't get so tunnel visioned on that you do nothing to think about what if somebody just walked in here. And it doesn't have to be a sophisticated attacker, right? It could be, kind of a low-grade hobbyist like myself, right? I just decide I'm going to go walk into my local hospital and drop something on your network. What I would drop is my favorite tool, which is Plugbot. And really all this needs is a Raspberry Pi. You could use a NUC or something like that, but for 40 bucks, 50 bucks, I can use a Raspberry Pi. And I could drop a bunch of these. I can tell you as a company, as Sensata, we are very successful with this. We do a lot of physical stuff, and when we have an operative go in and find a way to drop a Pi, it works pretty well to get onto the environment. So what happens, right? We talked about Plugbot. We have this machine now that's installed on the network, and we have the ability to drop bots on it, install bots, right? And bots are these little autonomous little programs that I can run and execute on your network now, right? So the way to think about this is I've gotten a server on your network that allows me to pretty much do whatever I want to do at that point, right? I have communication with it. And I can do a bunch of things. So what can I do? Well, basically, I'm going to start gathering intelligence again, right? So there are a bunch of bots that we have that we use when we're doing this kind of stuff. One of them is an asset bot. And what that asset bot does is it just really tries to figure out what's on your network. And it does this using SNMP. It can do some other stuff like Nmap and pinging, but that gets a little noisy, and a lot of people know to do that. It can also execute some custom Python, but typically it's SNMP. We're looking for that SNMP communication, and we're really mostly interested in your servers and your network appliances. So we're going to really look at SNMP and what's out there. We're not looking to do deep queries. We're just trying to figure out who's talking to who and what is it that's talking. And so these asset bots are really good for that, right? And the way it works is I sit in a hotel room, or wherever I'm at, behind a proxy chain, and I'm able to communicate using this dashboard to that bot. And I can just go, okay, let me drop the asset bot on this device and let it run for a couple days and see what happens. And it just so everybody knows, like, we take some of the lessons from the low and slow stuff we learned, right? The bot's not just going to go out and do a /24 query of your network. It's just going to sit there and kind of wake up every 5-10 minutes and do something. So it's not going to announce itself very broadly and go crazy. I will tell you a good defense for that would be things like honeypots, right? Because if this asset bot trips a honeypot, something's going wrong on the network. So honeypots, huge. Whoops, sorry, not sure why that happened. Huge fan. Not sure why people don't use more of them. If you want them, come talk to us. We've got really cool honeypot software. Second one we're going to do is backup, a backup systems bot. Now this bot, its job, we talked about this in the previous session, is really just to read the contents of backup files, is to identify where is your backup system, read the contents of the backup files, and inject some bad bits and bytes into those files so that it destroys the integrity of those files. So we're just basically corrupting data. So you're backing up corrupted data. So that's what that bot does. The share analyzer bot is going to look for file shares, right? Because at some point we may want to distribute malware. Maybe we're going to go do a crazy ransomware attack or something else. Maybe we want to do who knows what. But this bot has it relies mostly on SMB, but it can use SSH, FTP, HTTP, and Python modules to connect to systems and do file scans. So that's all that guy's doing. Privilege bot is really focused on Kerberos and Kerberos roasting, trying to figure out how we can break through that active domain. And then the HL7 bot is simply looking at HL7 and DICOM traffic. It's using promiscuous mode and attempting to grab traffic and just see what is going on with HL7 and DICOM. So these bots now, in our scenario, would be on the net, right? We took the shortcut of getting somebody to go physical. This could be done a variety of other ways, but I will tell you that we find this to be pretty successful with a physical compromise. And once it's on there, you can see there's a whole host of data that we're able to start gathering, and we're going to sit there and gather this data for quite some time. I'm going to skip through that. So how long have we been doing this, right? So if we were doing this for real, we probably would have carried all this out for about 6 months. So we've gone through the mission planning, the intelligence gathering, and the assessment of priorities, and then we've actually exploited, right? So the reason I'm bringing this up is I want to make sure you understand, because I find way too many people think that the attacks are like immediate, right? And we've got to start getting to understand it's the little things you see that trip up the attacker. It's the little things that you should be getting freaked out about, right? If you see an alert for SQL injection attack, yeah, you should get freaked out, right? But frankly, chances are once you do the forensics, you're going to find out that, oh man, this person's been in here for 6 months, and now we're just getting this crazy SQL injection alert, right? you need to look for the small stuff. I've often, when I talk about incident response and forensics, I always tell people there is no such thing as a false positive, right? Like if your domain controller is pinging a honeypot, there's something going on, right? You need to know, like, okay, this is a problem. It's the little stuff. Because the attackers, as much as we try to stay covert, there's always going to be something little that we give away. And obviously our job is to figure out how not to give away those little things, but doing the best we can not to tell you we're there. But sometimes we mess up and we give you little signs that we're out there. So things like honeypots, honey tokens, all of that really do make a huge difference. Because if they start talking to you and say, hey, somebody just touched me, you probably have a pretty big issue on your hands. It's just that nothing else has determined that. Just a real quick story I'll give you guys. We did a pen test a while ago where the organization spent, I think it was like 8 months locking down their VDI environment. And they actually brought in the vendor of the VDI software to help them lock it down. They also had a third-party SOC, not us, that was monitoring them 24/7, actually a pretty big name in the SOC business. And when we did the pen test, the goal was, can you break out of the VDI? Can you move through the network undetected? And the answer to that was yes. It took about 30 seconds to break out of the VDI, get to the network, and then start moving around. The reason I bring that up is because we did a lot of stuff and nothing tripped anything. And the reason for that is most tools are looking for some kind of pattern or behavior that trips up an attacker, right? Like if I deployed Cobalt Strike or Metasploit, right? I mean, those days are like gone. Like real attackers don't do that a lot anymore. Some of them do because they're just crazy, but most of that's like early 2000s, right? So you got to think about, like, today attackers have gotten to the point where you're looking for little tiny signs. Threat hunting is a big deal. Having somebody come in and do a class on how to look for the little things, those are kind of big dividends for you. But in this case, we've probably been in this network for 6 months now if we were doing this as a real scenario. So what are we going to do, right? In this case, our original mission was to shake people up, screw them up, right? Mess with their heads, get people to lose confidence in the ability of the organization to care for patients. So based on our Shodan stuff, our Plugbot stuff, all the things that we've kind of gone through, we're probably going to compromise the oxygenation system, right? We got a central monitoring system here. They've got remote monitoring. They've got some cloud monitoring. We're just going to find a way to mess with this automatic control system, and find a way to just stop the oxygen from flowing. And that's a pretty scary attack for people, and it's probably one that most organizations wouldn't think of having done, because this stuff lives under facilities or somebody else in the org. It's not part of IT. So nobody's really asking, like, hey, what's on that workstation? What do you mean Windows XP? All right. Oh, what do you mean there's no, everybody's logging in as admin? So this is probably what we would go after. It's a pretty big splash. It would scare the heck out of a lot of people very quickly. But just in case they didn't get scared, we would send an email to everybody's social media account that we found as part of our Catfish exercise, telling them that, yeah, we took your oxygenation system offline. Now, this email would hopefully go to regular employees, right? We want to send this to nurses, doctors, lab techs, respiratory techs, kind of the on-the-ground clinical staff for the hospital. And it doesn't matter if we get to 2 or 3 people or we get to 200 or 300, because what's going to happen is people are going to get this email on their personal account and they're going to share it. They're either going to share it back with IT security or HR. They're going to share it with their friends, their supervisor. And what do people do in hospitals around the nurses' stations? They talk, they gossip, right? And the problem here is people are going to freak because we somehow found their personal email account. Now, all of us know how easy that is to do, but if you're not technical and suddenly you've had an 8-hour, 9-hour, 10-hour, 12-hour shift, you come home or you're on your phone on the way home or wherever you're doing it, or even at work, you're checking your email, you just knew that, hey, all the oxygen systems went out in the hospital, it's been a rough day, and now you get an email on your personal Gmail or whatever you're using, Yahoo, Hotmail, whatever, and it's telling you, we did this attack and here, we want you to know about it. You're gonna freak, right? Now, why is this so important? Well, one of our mission objectives was to disrupt patient care. And I don't know if I talked about this here. I've talked about this in part of incident response planning classes we do. There's something known as the Vanderbilt study. Long and short of the Vanderbilt study is they looked at a bunch of cyber attacks that cause significant operational impact, a significant cyber attack. Is anything that disrupts operations in the hospital. Doesn't have to be a full-blown ransomware. If it disrupts operations, that's a significant attack. And what they found is after an attack, any significant attack, people die, patient mortality increases. And why is that? It's not because the attackers got to the smart pump and changed the medication profiles. It's because the clinicians get distracted. They become emotionally distracted, psychologically distracted, and they start getting questioning. Is my data, my employee data been compromised? What happened? Nobody's telling us what's going on. Is it safe to use these systems or not? If they got to the oxygen system, can they get to something else? How did they get to my email? How did they get to Avery's email? Right? How did all this come together? And so that distraction impacts patient care. And that impact on patient care ultimately is an impact on patient mortality. So all this stuff is kind of tied back to the patient. And my hope in not just this session, but in the entire series is ultimately to tie all that back together, to get people to understand that it doesn't really take much to impact care. And when you impact care, you really truly are messing with people's lives. You don't need to have the big front page article that, hey, so-and-so got to the lab system and redid all the formularies, or sorry, the pharmacy system and redid formularies. So that's kind of the series. I'm hoping you got something. Before we go, I want to give you a couple things. We're thinking of doing this thing called a cybersecurity chalk talk. We may have a different name for it, but idea here is about 30-minute sessions, not sure on the timing, maybe monthly or quarterly, that are really highly interactive, different topic every time. Hopefully people participate and come up with topics and contribute. Really want to kind of build a community forum. So you'll get updates on that probably in the next several weeks or so. So watch your email if you have ideas of what would be cool to have in a chalk talk. We want to do it a lot like these, but maybe less formal, and just kind of talk through stuff, right? Whiteboard it and just kind of have a dialogue on security topics, intermediate to advanced topics. So hopefully that's interesting to you. Hope you take away a bunch of stuff from here. One is we often rationalize what we don't understand and what we fear. You got to, the more education you have, the more you learn, the less fearful you become. Unfortunately, attackers are highly organized, right? They're very well funded, they're innovative, and unfortunately, they're underrated a lot of times. Hopefully this series, we actually started this series because we realized people don't respect the audacity and innovation of attackers. I'm hoping this was a different perspective for a lot of you, and you kind of walk away going, yeah, that we've got to up our game, right? We've got to be more respectful of the attackers. They have a bunch of different tool sets that they can play with. Many of the things that we trust, that we believe is the right way to do security, kind of create a false sense of security. They're kind of dated, right? I often talk about that most security is 10 years ago, right? We're really defending against things that happened 10 years ago. So we're kind of behind this 8 ball. And I don't think it's anybody's fault. I think it's just ultimately leadership in organizations doesn't understand the amount of work that you need to do to keep up with the current threat landscape. And that's a challenge, obviously. One of the most biggest pieces of advice is, have an aggressive understanding of threats and bold defenses. Think out of the box, right? Be thoughtful of the tools and the tactics and the procedures that you use, and don't just get comfortable with, well, we'll just move to the cloud or we'll just do that. There is no pure answer other than your tenacity and you being as creative and innovative as the attackers are. So with that, I'm truly hopeful you found the 6-session series to be positive and, give you food for thought. If there's anything we can do for you, whether that's on the risk assessment side, pen testing, our cybersecurity as a service program with SOC, the medical device security stuff that we do, our Nightingale platform, our honeypots, there's a lot that we do. We try to do it all really as well as we can. We're always learning, don't know it all, so always welcome your feedback. So with that, Lauren, Melissa, are there any questions or?
We did have one question around vulnerability management.
Yep.
And the question was, they've made sure they have full visibility of all their assets, and they want to know if they should sort the assets into their organizational structure per department so that each department has a view of the vulnerabilities on the assets. They want to know if this will improve their vulnerability management program.
So yeah, I think it would. There's two things I would. So actually, yeah, that's a great question. I have a lot of answers to it. I've seen this work really, what you're describing, work really well in the defense industry. There's a great guy out of the West Coast named Rodney Smith who taught me this. Really smart, strong player out of the defense area. And so what you're describing is used a lot in the defense industry, where ultimately IT is not responsible for every asset. It's really the departments are responsible. I know that's hard to pull off, especially at smaller organizations, but basically what IT security does and compliance, it says, here's the standard, right? You need to maintain this level of security standard. And if your system isn't up to that standard, then there's consequences for that. So yeah, if you can do that, what you described, if that's what you're describing, I think that's what you're describing, having ownership be given to that organization and then having some kind of scorecard, it's very powerful if you can say, hey, we're going to now produce a scorecard that's going to show by department who's got the most secure systems and who doesn't. Now, if you can get management and leadership to do this at a business level, right, where it's not just IT, but it's really the C-suite is saying, we want to know who's got the most secure systems and doesn't have the most secure systems and what's getting in the way of security. That's a very powerful strategy. The other thing I would add to that strategy, if you can do it, is request that the departments or the asset owners, if you haven't already done this, is declare asset valuation. Like, is this an asset level 1 or an asset level 3 or 4 or 5? I don't think we talk about asset values in this program, so I'll touch on them really quickly. This is something we do in our Nightingale software platform, right? So Nightingale, for asset value 1 would be like a printer. Asset value 5 would be something that supports or diagnoses life. Asset value 3 would be in the middle and be like operationally significant. You can figure out what 2 and 4 are. But having an asset value for each system really does help with things like incident response and a bunch of other stuff. In our software, it supports alert correlation, but just even if you don't use our stuff, having asset values is critical. The one thing I will tell you about asset value is that's your view of the world, right? Your department owner or you as IT security is, I think this is an asset value 4 or 5. And you may say a printer is an asset value 1. We can live without those, right? The problem with that is that represents your view, not the attacker's view. So several years ago, we created something called HVT assets, high value target assets. And the idea behind the high value target, it's binary, Boolean, is it either is or isn't. Anything can be a high value target. So for example, if you get threat intelligence that attackers are attacking the firmware in HP printers, well, that's now a high value target. It may be asset value 1, the organization can live without it if there's a catastrophe or it's the last thing that you need to bring online or whatever your disaster recovery plan is. So it could be asset value 1, but the attacker's perspective is, no, that's a high value target. So you need a way to figure out, like, okay, how do you represent that attacker's perspective? And one way to do that is with high value targets. So hopefully all that was in line with the question you asked. If not, please let us know in the chat room or email us. But hopefully that all makes sense. That's a lot of these concepts I'm talking about with high value targets, the Vanderbilt study, asset valuation, that's all part of our cybersecurity tactical incident response class. And if you guys haven't heard about it or gone through that program, feel free to reach out to us. It's a pretty intense program on real world incident response. And it really focuses on how do you respond to incidents that involve human life. It's pretty eye-opening. We actually use the program as part of our medical device security program, but it's very different in terms of incident response and tactical forensics and all that stuff than probably most incident response programs. So that's where all that comes from. Any other questions, Laura? Or?
No more questions.
All right. Well, again, thank you guys very, very much. Hopefully we'll be interacting in some way, shape, or form in the near future. If you have any feedback or anything we can do for you, please reach out. My email's on the screen. And as always, you can go back and review any of the other presentations. And if any of you want to present, more than happy to have co-presenters or have you guys center stage. So just let us know. But with that, thank you so much.